New research helps focus attention on North Carolina's recovery from COVID-19. The news is generally good if policymakers make wise decisions. Joining us now with details about the research is Dr. Edward Lopez. He's an economics professor and director of the Center for the Study of Free Enterprise at Western Carolina University. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Mitch. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I'm happy to have you, and it's always good to see new information about how North Carolina can cope with COVID-19 and come out at the back end of this pandemic in as good a situation as possible. Sounds as if the report that you and a colleague have put together suggests that the news could be good as long as we make the right decisions.
That's right. And I think the perspective here is on how policymakers create a climate that can be measured. They create a climate for the economy that can be measured as an assessment of economic health in an economy using statewide data such as North Carolina. And that's the approach. That's part of what we're doing in this study is we're trying to take a pulse of economic health in the economy. And overall, as we maybe can get to in a little bit more detail, we find that there is a good basis for North Carolina to say that we're in good economic health coming into the pandemic.
Yeah, in fact, why don't we go ahead and get into some of those details? Not all states were in that situation. Some had a lot of problems with their budgets going into the pandemic. North Carolina seems to be in relatively good shape compared to its peers.
Yeah, now what we want to do in this study, as we do with everything at the center, is make sure that it's well grounded in, academic scholarship. And so we do sort of pin down an approach that includes both top-down forces and bottom-up forces in an economy over time. And we know that over time, economies do suffer what economists call shocks. And some of these shocks come from natural disasters and others come from things like pandemics. But they do affect economic plans, they do affect economic resources. And so the way economists approach it and the way that we approach it in the paper is to say, how well is an economy situated to respond to these shocks? And that really comes down to, two main factors. There's the top-down factors and the bottom-up factors. Now, when it comes to talking about North Carolina's budget, we would include that in the top-down factor. The reason is because the better the condition of the North Carolina budget, the better the capacity for the North Carolina budget, the better the capacity for the North Carolina government to respond to a shock, such as the coronavirus pandemic. And looking at the budget, we were able to sort of pin down some of the facts and some of the reasons why it's fair to say that North Carolina came into the pandemic in pretty good shape from this top-down capacity perspective.
How about from the bottom up, since you mentioned that is also a part of your study?
And this is also going to be really dependent on what policymakers decide. We look at another set of factors for the bottom-up scenario. We similarly find that North Carolina comes into it in pretty good condition, but for the reasons that don't involve the budget so much as they involve the way taxes are raised, the way occupations are regulated, the way markets in general are regulated in the state. And what has been happening there for about the past decade is North Carolina has been making some improvements to its portfolio of economic policies. And this has made North Carolina in a better condition than it would be otherwise coming into the pandemic.
Want to look at some of the things that have been reported about the study at this point. It says that researchers found that when it comes to North Carolina's goals for growth and prosperity, economic freedom indexes are the most important among all barometers of economic prospects for growth, drawing from both the state level data and using the most recent studies, the municipal level. So economic freedom sounds like a major key to how we're going to come out of this, and whether we do well will depend on how free we are.
Well, there are different approaches to sort of taking the pulse of the economic health of an economy, as we mentioned in the paper. But we do think that given that the state's leaders have announced, have committed to the long-term goals of growth and prosperity for North Carolinians, our perspective as economists says that we should focus on indexes of economic freedom. And the reason for that is because when people are have more freedom to pursue their economic lives without undue restrictions, history and economic theory tell us that more innovation happens, and that does put us on the path towards the stated goals of our leaders, towards growth and towards prosperity. So we bring economic freedom to the front and center of this discussion because it is important to what state leaders have said is their goal for North Carolina to experience more growth and more prosperity for its people.
In a news release that Western Carolina University put out about this study, you're quoted as saying, to promote our state's leaders' goals of growth and prosperity, our analysis supports three broad policy conclusions: maintain fiscal discipline, a healthy level of economic freedom, and a good balance of economic freedom in the state. Why are those three so important?
That's right. Well, for coming to the top down and bottom up way of our approach, the healthy fiscal condition is important for the top down capacity. But and we know that a healthy economy depends on a high level of economic freedom. So we bring those two forward as broad conclusions that that any concerned citizen or policymaker in North Carolina can take and say, here's something important to look at if we do want growth and prosperity. Now, we do add a third conclusion in there based on more recent research that looks at across the portfolio of economic policies in a state, how balanced is economic freedom in those different policy areas? And this has become important. Economists have put their finger on this because you can have two different states that are sort of equally comparable in overall levels of economic freedom. But if one is very, very imbalanced, so that they have high freedom in some areas, such as perhaps occupations, but low economic freedom in other areas, such as tax competitiveness, that imbalance is going to hurt the innovative process. It's going to hurt the processes that economists have known and been sort of asking for centuries that lead to growth and prosperity. But the other state, if it has more balance among its institutions, is going to be better situated there. These are some new findings that are coming out that we lean on. We lean on these new findings that are coming out in the economics literature to bring this study forward to the folks of North Carolina.
So we've basically been talking about broad principles, but as our General Assembly, which is now back at work, looks at what to do ahead in the coming weeks and months, what are some of the types of things that these broad principles would translate into? I'm guessing they would have significant impacts on what kind of spending you have in the future, or what kind of tax rates and occupational licensing restrictions and other things of that sort. What are some of the types of things they ought to keep in mind?
Well, I think that it is the case that the approach that we take in the paper can be used to study some specific policy areas and sort out some of the granular information that could be useful to policy discussions in those areas. As for this study, we're still able to make a sort of general recommendation, if you will, because it is the case that in times of uncertainty, governments are called upon to do something and to at least attempt to address that uncertainty. And nothing in our study suggests that that is not the case, nor should it not be the case. What we're suggesting, though, is when governments are making their decisions about what to do in a time of uncertainty or crisis, they ought to have in mind the role that their decisions have in reducing economic freedom in the areas of policy that they're operating through, and recognize that perhaps they could increase economic freedom in other areas of the policy portfolio, maybe in other areas that are not as timely and critical in the moment, that may not have such a downside to the public interest if you were to relax them or loosen them. Our approach says if you're going to have to reduce economic freedom in some area to serve the legitimate public interest, in a time of uncertainty especially, you ought to look for other areas to increase economic area in other areas, because the overall level and the balance across the portfolio of economic freedom, research shows that it's important to the future of growth and prosperity in the state.
Well, we have barely scratched the surface, and if people wanted to get some real world implications of this research, they ought to read the report. So what's the best way for people to get access to it?
I appreciate that, Mitch. You can just go to enterprise.wcu.edu. That's our website, enterprise.wcu.edu. And we have all of our issue briefs and all of our content, as well as profiles of our people on that website. And we'd love to hear from your listeners and anyone who takes an interest in our work.
And the co-author of that new report from the Center for the Study of Free Enterprise at Western Carolina University is the center's director and an economics professor at WCU, Dr. Edward Lopez. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mitch.